BBC television programme Railway Roundabout was a half-hour series produced once a month for just on 5 years, 1958 to 1962. The presenters, Patrick Whitehouse and John Adams, took the films, cut them and did the commentaries live in the studio. Most of the programmes were British, but a number dealt with railways in Europe, ranging from Finland to Yugoslavia. This video programme takes in scenes filmed by Pat Whitehouse in southern Europe. The direct Orient Express has a sound of magic to its name, but by 1967, it's a very poor version of its former self. Starting at Paris's Gare de Lyon at 11:50 in the evening, 2 wagon-Lee sleepers and 3 further first and second class coaches go through to Istanbul 4 days a week and Athens 3. The route is via France, Switzerland, Italy, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, the coaches being tacked onto so-called express trains in each country. The journey takes 3 nights and almost 3 days, and there's no dining car from the Swiss border until you get to Turkey or Greece. So the journey can be somewhat of a marathon if you're not prepared. And in this form, the train has a decade of life left. The first possible sight of any steam is in Italy. And this will be rare 280 number 740045, seen just outside Milan on shunting duty. And this plus the odd 260 will be all that can be found. The scenery here, and indeed for most of the journey beyond Switzerland, is unexciting. But there are a few compensations, such as Mussolini's fine palace of a station in Milan Centrale. This station, built as an outward and visible sign of the dictator's power to improve the then chaotic rail services in Italy, is certainly impressive, with its great curved roof and magnificent concourse. But these factors are not the vital ones for the direct Orient passengers. They need to think about food, for there will be little, if anything, available once Italy has been left behind, and there's now no dining car. The station vendors are pressing in their sales of dolls, but better to walk down to the buffet trolley and stock up with cheese, bread, ham and wine. There's plenty, and it's cheap enough. The next stop is Venice, then in the evening, the border at Trieste, ready for the dullness of Yugoslavia. The morning brings the approaches to Belgrade and almost certainly some Yugoslav steam on freights and the usual passenger trains. The train stops at most stations, and the approaches to towns of any size are grim, with blocks of stereotype flats constructed as far as the eye can see. In the rain they look particularly Spartan. Belgrade station can produce a form of refreshment trolley, but it's only dry biscuits, Yugo cola and a form of Yugo coffee. The platforms are not the cleanest in the world either. As the express is about to leave, there's a piece of good fortune, the arrival of a local behind a Yugoslav Pacific, a class of engine which will take the direct Orient on its final leg out of that country into Bulgaria. The lack of a platform does not seem to worry the local people, who descend bag and baggage onto the tracks. In a moment, the express is away, passing a small tank engine shunting. From now on until Greece, photography is forbidden by order of the guardians of the people's liberty, in other words, the train's policemen. Next morning, it's Greece and Volos in the rain, passing the standard gauge shed as the train runs in. But even in this awful weather, Volos, halfway up the east coast from Athens, is intriguing and satisfying. How many places in the world are there with 3 different gauges and steam on each one of them, and the masts of fishing boats crowded up to the sides of the road and rail? We leave the standard gauge behind to look at the harbour shunt, which is performed by a meter gauge 260 tank built by Dubrovnik in 1921, one of 3 similar locos kept for the job. The passenger service westwards across the plains to Kelempaka is run by modern rail cars manufactured by Breda of Italy, dating from 1951. These even carry a small bar. There is, however, a daily mixed train in each direction using steam, probably a 262 tank with 4-wheeled stock, where the peculiar toilet facilities are provided in a covered van with a partition across it at one end to provide a cubicle with Asiatic-type apparatus. But most passengers use the rail car, which runs right into the main street. It's fast, clean and handy. The rail cars have conventional buffers and can be used to tow a trailer or maybe an extra van. The livery, blue and grey with a yellow lining, hardly visible in this awful weather. Hiding away in the loco shed, sadly out of use today, is an ex-Brunig Railway 060 tank by Winterthur, its empty cylinders for the rack gear a reminder of its mountainous past. But there is something even more rewarding that runs through the main street of Volos. And it's steam too. The nominal 2-foot gauge line, actually 60 centimeters, runs eastwards, scaling the sides of Pelion, some 18 miles to the little town of Millet. It starts its journey in the forecourt of the mainline station, but soon runs through the harbour, passing over the multi-gauge tracks used by standard and narrow-gauge rail cars. In spite of its tram-like appearance, the train is well used, as it's extremely cheap. Like a tram or a rail car, the train seems to stop almost by request as it trundles along the main street, the only use this far along of the mixed gauge. The railway has 2 engines in everyday use, both 260 tanks carrying names. Number 101 Millet, built by Dubrovnik of Belgium in 1908, and number 102 Jason, a younger brother by Alain Saint-Pierre in 1912. Each carries an oval number and works plate. Traffic is sparse. There's only one return journey from each terminus every day. The competing bus service has seen to that. Most passengers seem to be either railwaymen or countryfolk living round the upper sections of the line, which have no roads available to heavy motor vehicles. Likewise, there's little or no freight, and certainly no separate freight trains, goods being taken in the vans attached to the passenger train. In contrast with its larger neighbour, the Millet line uses bogie coaches, albeit one class only, with longitudinal wooden seating. There's no first class. There are a couple of passing loops in the main street, and these are the official stopping places. With traffic and trains as sparse as they are today, these are really anachronisms. Unusually for a minuscule European railway, a train staff is in use to regulate the single line working. Normally these lines seem to be run on the principle of God and the telephone. The journey in each direction for the 18 miles is normally well over 2 hours, even coming back when it's downhill from Millet. The next actual station is at Anno Laconia, 7.5 miles out of Volos, and from here the line changes from a roadside tramway to a railway in its own right. But until then it runs only a few feet above sea level, adjacent to the road round the bay. The whole affair is a relic of past days when railways were the only form of public transport available, bar horse-drawn traffic, and the line to Mile is very much a living museum piece, without the sometimes unreal trappings which go with working preservation today. Sarajevo Station, beautifully rebuilt by the Tito regime, is almost a social centre in 1962. But like the French, the Yugoslavs are rather ashamed of their narrow-gauge lines, and the railway over the mountains to Dubrovnik is hidden away at the back. It's almost a day's journey climbing over the barren hills, including a rack section and an amount of double heading. It's one of the finest and longest 75-centimetre systems in Europe. The rack section begins at Bradina, with rack engines coupled on front and rear. Sadly, there was little filming here, as the camera team was arrested, but got away unharmed. So nothing was able to happen until matters got sorted out at Dubrovnik, where there was a lot to see, fortunately. Dubrovnik terminus, flower-decked with hanging baskets, had a friendly station master who allowed filming at the station and on the shed, promising more help the next day. So before wandering down over the bauxite-covered tracks, these were some shots of an 83 class 082 and an UNRWA, in full if you like, United Nations Relief Association, American-built 280, complete with spark arrestor, rather like those which were used on the narrow-gauge lines in Colorado. The air pump and brake cylinder complete the picture. The team plus interpreter then got a number of shots in the yard, including a lovely bogie wagon, complete with brakeman's hut at one end, before walking down to the depot at the far end of the yard. It was a very busy scene, with a number of engines being coaled and watered. These included an 83 class 082, number 83149, with a polished shell case full of flowers on her running board, and Yugoslav railway wings and wheel badge on her smoke box, headlamp and spark-arresting chimney. Two others, an 83 and an 85 class 262, were ready to back down onto a train which had been made up in the yard. Meanwhile, the yard goat, in the form of the UNRWA engine, was still hard at it, moving box fans, steam drifting lazily from her whistle. The two engines just prepared on the shed drop down one by one onto what turns out to be a very long mixed train, the 85 class going to the rear to act as a banker, whilst number 83135 came down to be the pilot. It was becoming more and more obvious that this was no ordinary narrow-gauge line, but a main artery of traffic. The huge trains full of bauxite from the port was evidence of this. The Austrians, who built the railway during the heyday of their empire, saw to it that this line, of some military importance, was not only well built, but the locomotive stock was standardized as well as sturdy. Their 83 and 85 class engines were proof of both. After a little tinkering and oiling, it was time to depart. The train was to go all the way to Sarajevo yards, including a trip up the rack, where it would have to be split. As the train slowly made its way out of the orangey-brown covered tracks, the engines working hard and eldritch whistles shrieking, this suddenly became the place to be. Where else in Europe would one find such a spot, on 750mm gauge as well? As each engine came past, it was educational as well as fascinating to see the variations of the 082s with their drum-like spark-arrested and slide-valve cylinders, then two quite modern steel-sided coaches which had not been cleaned for months, a huge string of wagons. Then, last but certainly not least, the more modern 85 class 282, pushing away as if her life depended on it. It was sight and sound to be remembered. Riding up with the mixed, one was able to see the considerable engineering works on the line. Track cut into the virgin rock, tunnels and spirals. It was breathtaking. The next problem on the agenda was how the team would be received at the top of the grade at Hum, a tiny village with a huge marshalling yard and the junction for the line to Titograd. In fact, Hum provided a variety of traffic, mostly hauled by 83 class 082s, those coming up the bank having their fires cleaned for good measure. The passenger coaches were packed to the doors, for public transport is cheap in Yugoslavia. This is certainly so with a trainload of youngsters headed towards Mostar behind 83149. After this train had departed, there was a chance to have a quick look at one of the older classes bound for Titograd with a freight. Within minutes, another 83 came in bound for Dubrovnik. It was lucky to catch it before being arrested again. Welcome to Vienna, and the Austrians mean it. Certainly, from the railway point of view in the late 1950s and early 60s, it was a worthwhile place with a fully working steamshed, trams and stations with an abundance of traffic, local, national and international. The Südbahnhof, completely rebuilt after the devastation of World War II, was easily reached by tram, a good rail start for any journey. This was and is the station for the mountainous route to the southeast via the Semmering Pass. The Transalpine is one of the fast Trans-Europe expresses, known as the TEEs. It's made up as a Swiss first and second class multiple unit electric set and carries a supplement to the normal fare. But its comfort and convenience is well worth it. It has full restaurant car facilities. Most of Austria's railway system is now electrified. Wartime devastation making wholesale rebuilding a necessity, and with aid from the victor nations, rehabilitation was swift. Steam, under the circumstances, had a limited life and is used either on the more secondary lines, not yet electrified, on some suburban trains, and mostly on freight. It tends to be in the hands of a few 480s, 464 and 462 tanks, and 210s. Of the 210Os, the 52 class or Kriegslock is far the most common. Built by Germany during the war in their thousands, these simple, hardy and efficient machines found their way not only into Austria and the German satellite states, but even into Russia. The Austrian variety has in recent years been fitted, as has most Austrian steam, with the Giesel ejector, an ugly flat chimney leading from a multiple orifice blast pipe, giving greater efficiency with poor coal. The Südbahnhof is now left behind, and we are at Glocknitz, at the foot of the Semmering Pass. Dr. Giesel, the inventor of the ejector, has just joined the train for the journey across the eastern end of the Alps to Mörzuschlag, through 15 tunnels and over 9 viaducts to Graz, Austria's second city. In 1959, the electrification over this route is not yet complete, and from Mörzuschlag onwards the passenger is likely to be hauled by steam. The Semmering line is just settling down to electrification, and the steam shed, once used entirely for pilots and bankers at Klognitz, is almost empty of living engines, bar the odd 060 tanks used for permanent way trains. As the local train, with but one electric engine, hums its way under the wires over viaducts and through tunnels, Dr. Giesel reflects on his invention, which has been taken very seriously in his native land and, strangely enough, in East Africa. It's not taken on in Great Britain, mainly because steam is now to be phased out, and the powers that be can see no reason to increase steam's efficiency. It would be bad for their modern image. In fact, two trials were made, one with a Class 9 210 and the other with a Southern Light Pacific. They proved to be very satisfactory, but no further steps were taken. Riding in the cab of the electric loco, the driver's eye view emphasizes the twisting climb, easily accomplished when power is coming down to the wires to the humming electric engine. But in the only recent days of steam, an operating problem needing double heading and banking. Electrification has proved to be a boon to the operating department, but the enthusiast will miss the tremendous thrill of seeing and hearing steam thundering up round the curves and over those fine viaducts. But in the early summer of 1959, it is still steam and diesel beyond Mörzuschlag, with a variety of motive power from 210s, with and without Giesel ejectors, to 464 tanks on passenger trains. Diesels coming in the form of Triebwagen, multiple unit sets. The freights are usually heavy, and the sight of a massive German Class 50 210 trundling a load of knocking 1,000 tons is impressive, even if they are drifting down the grade and blowing off gently. No mechanical problems here. Steam is still maintained in first-class order. Mörzuschlag is home to the great Scholler-Bleckmann steelworks, where they make the Giesel ejectors, and the yard here is worked by steam, using two Orienstein and Koppel 060 Well tanks. The 760mm tracks link the two works, and in morning and evening they actually run a passenger service. One of these is in its conventional form with a standard spark arrestor. The other, which is named Hans, has a Giesel oblong ejector, which, because it lowers the cylinder back pressure considerably, allows a very soft exhaust with little fire throwing, thus averting the need for a spark arrestor. Hans was the first narrow-gauge engine to be so fitted. Another notable one was in Wales, the Talyllyn Railway's No. 4 Edward Thomas, a gift from Scholler-Bleckmann, arranged by Dr. Giesel. Back on the main line, traffic is heavy in each direction, with local trains behind 464 tanks and a small 060 tank to shunt Scholler-Bleckmann's yard, whilst a Giesel-fitted Class 52 210 precedes an engineer's permanent way rail car, the two workings on a permissive system within the block, rather like clockwork Hornby trains, wound up carefully, so that one chases the other without actually catching it. After this, a 480, an unusual sight these days, takes a passenger express in the other direction. As soon as this is gone, the little condensing 060 tank darts out for a moment with some wagons, making up a train to go north. Having a ride in the cab of an electric, Pat Whitehouse was then able to sample the delights of Austrian steam with a cab ride down to Graz on one of the large 464 tanks. He was impressed with the smooth ride and the almost silent exhaust due to the Giesel ejector. Graz produced a fabulous contrast in an outside-framed veteran 440 belonging to the Graz Koflacher Eisenbahn, dating back to 1863, one of several belonging to this unusual private railway, and on a passenger train too. The next visit was to the Styrian local government railway, some metre and some standard gauge. The narrow gauge engines included two 062 tanks, one used by the famous Salzkammergut Lochalbahn out of Salzburg, now sadly closed, an unusual coaling device. And this 1899-built U2 062 tank, now fitted with a Giesel ejector, whilst Dr. Giesel, in the black shirt, chats with the shed foreman and checks the smoke box to make sure that his ejector has proved to have done its job. It has, hardly any ash to be seen. The ejector has certainly proved to be efficient, but it hardly improves the appearance of the engine. Meanwhile, shunting the yard, one of the ex-Salzkammergut engines, number S12, makes a happy sight, its tall chimney giving it an air of longevity. Within another quarter of an hour, it will make up its train, which leaves over the meadows for Oberfeitstritz and Bergfeld, 24 kilometers away. The journey will take almost an hour, as there are grades of 1 in 50 and 1 in 40 en route. Sadly, on August the 12th, 1962, U2 ran into a landslip and fell more than 30 feet down an embankment, ending up as scrap. The standard gauge line to Gleisdorf, en route to Graz, runs adjacent to the narrow gauge, and this has always been steam routed, using a 262 tank, one of a pair purchased second-hand from the OBB, who in turn bought it from a Swiss private line. These engines were purchased by the Styrian government as early as 1928, so the Weiz-Gleisdorf line had become a kind of mecca to Swiss enthusiasts. Looking through the loading gauge at the fly shunting, one can see the small standard gauge goods yard and the ancient six-wheel coaches, which sometimes form part of the mixed train. The morning shunt over, number 13004 couples onto the train ready to take her stock over 15 kilometers to Gleisdorf to make a connection with an OBB Triebwagen set for Graz. These are two-car units with 500 horsepower motor and hydraulic drive. Graz Steam Shed is still very active, having a number of classes as well as acting as a servicing point for the superbly antique Graz Koflacher Eisenbahn, with its almost prehistorically old engines. The OBB power is nearly the opposite, with Kriegslock 210s, 462 and 464 tanks, though there are some ancient 080s about on shunting duties. These are Goldstoff compounds dating from the early parts of the century. Some of the 080s, like the more modern tank engines, have the Giesel oblong ejector and ugly flat chimney. The 464 tanks are relatively modern, dating from 1937 onwards. They were built for, and are still used on, the lighter fast express trains and are fully superheated. Even in 1959, these engines are in regular use on such expresses as the through service from Graz to Amsterdam via Setzal, Salzburg, Munich, Stuttgart, Cologne and Arnhem. They run as far as Bischofshof. The start is gentle, running past green colour light signals, a sign of some automatic train control. This route out of Austria is in complete contrast with the Semmering line, using the river valleys as it runs northwestwards towards the city of music. It's rolling hills and rivers for a large section of the journey. With steam still very much alive in this part of Austria, one keeps a weather eye very much open for sheds on the way, mostly with 080s and 210 Kriegslocks, which also turn up on the odd freight train waiting in station yards. Austria is still well worth a visit for steam. Just over an hour's travelling time by rail from Bolzano, there's a lovely valley in what was once part of Austria. The station is Chiusa, and what is more, it's the starting point for a 2 foot 6 inch, 760mm gauge railway, built of course by the Austrians, which runs up into the mountains at Plan. It is perhaps the perfect steam Kleinbahn, its engines 080 tanks dating from the railway's origin in 1915-16. They were built by Krauss and are painted glistening black. John Adams followed the little train with its verandahed bogie coaches up to Plan through meadows, climbing heights by loops, reaching its terminus much used by skiers during the winter, one reason for the line's continued existence. The whole character changes from farmland to the rugged peaks of the Dolomites, where the engine hides away in its wooden shed. It takes 2¼ hours to climb up 3,543 feet, a wonderful piece of engineering with a Lilliputian railway. Europe's southwestern corner is somewhat out on a limb, as are its railways. Spain's standard gauge is 5 foot 6 inches, and therefore completely at variance with all the other European railways. Even today, this leads to difficulties, as Spain, still outside the EEC, can't run through trains to its immediate neighbour, France. Various solutions have been used over the years, including transporter wagons and stock with exchangeable wheel sets. Whatever is done, Spain remains different, and the Railway Roundabout cameras, with the addition of John Snell, went to Spain and Portugal to record their steam workings. The RENFE, the National Railway System, employed very French-looking engines, such as this 2200 Class 482 Mountain, seen near La Encina on a Madrid to Alicante train. Note the mixture of stock. However, the most notable Spanish locomotives were their 282 plus 282 Bayer Garrett machines, Spain being the only country in Europe besides Great Britain to use the famous articulated locomotives. These ones are seen on a Tarragona to Lerida freight and then leaving on another westbound working. The extraordinary effect of the wide gauge on the appearance of Spanish locomotives and Portuguese mainline machines, as the 5 foot 6 inch gauge was in use there as well, is seen to good effect on these very British-looking locomotives at Alcalteria. The British look is not surprising. They're the products of Bear Peacock's Gorton foundry in Manchester, as are the Garretts, of course. If you took off the massive headlights and changed the cap, these could look at home on any British railway, which in fact they were, as this is the Great Southern of Spain Railway, its proper name, as it was British owned. There were 40 of these 260 moguls. All were built in the 1880s and survived intact as late as 1967. The products of Gorton were popular in Spain. This is a Bear Peacock 262 tank on the meter gauge Alcoy to Gandia. The locomotive was built in the 1890s and the railway, 34 miles long, had 6 of them. A smaller gauge of 75 centimetres was used on the San Feliu to Girona line. This railway, whose initials are emblazoned in raised brass letters on the side of the little tank engine, drawing to a stop alongside the water tank and column, ran for 25 miles between its termini. There were 8 of these 062 tanks built in Germany by Krauss. Finally, we see an American tank, Baldwin-built on the meter gauge Ponferrada to Viablino coal mining line, which also carried passengers. In the late 1960s, Portugal's narrow gauge lines were all going strong, and there was only just a whiff of dieselisation in the form of rail cars. There were three main systems, that in the south based at Sanada da Voga, the Douro Valley lines east of Porto, and the busy Porto suburban system, based at Trindade station. All were meter gauge. The Sanada da Voga lines ran west to Aveiro, north to Aspino, and west to Viseu. A glorious combination of tank engines were in use, ranging from tiny 260s to 2460 compounds to 282s. All these types were in regular use on passenger trains, which were usually mixed. Perhaps the most vigorous system of all was that based on Porto, where suburban trains ran in extremely frequent service, morning and evening times in particular, in and out of Trindade terminus. Part of the way it was even double track, where trains had a nifty turn of speed. In the late 1960s, early 70s, Trindade station in the evening was at least 90% steam, with trains coming in and out every few minutes, headed by 260 tanks, which were in the minority, 0440 Malay tanks with gleaming copper-capped chimneys, and Henschel 282 tanks, big enough for the standard gauge, let alone a meter gauge railway. Most had to be cold, watered and turned before going out again. The 0440 Malays in particular were pretty little machines, just right somehow for a narrow gauge railway. They looked right, worked right, and were there in abundance. Like all Portuguese substandard gauge locos, they carried the E prefix before their numbers, in this case at the base of their chimneys. Coaching stock was comfortable bogies, well suited to commuter trains, and the rail cars, moderns, often running in tandem. Faster and quicker off the mark than the steam services, they naturally carried less people, which gave them a disadvantage in the high loading peak hour periods, but a distinct advantage operationally. The livery was dark blue, corresponding to that of the newer bogie stock. They were two-man operated, a driver and a travelling conductor to act as guard and ticket inspector. The Henschel 282 tanks, like so many of the Portuguese meter gauge engines, all had copper-capped chimneys, again with their number plates on the sides. To see one waiting at the platform end was to realise that this was a real railway. Station work was fast. No sooner was the train emptied of passengers than the engine was unhooked, ran round the train and drifted back into the servicing area adjacent to the tunnel under the city. Whilst neat 0440 tanks run in and out with their trains, one of these engines remains a station pilot. These engines are relatively elderly, dating from 1905, whereas the smoke-deflected Henschel 282 tanks were built in 1931. But the most elderly are the 260 tanks, some of them going back to 1886 with copper-capped bell mouths. They come from a variety of builders, Decoville, Kessler, Orenstein and Koppel, and Esslingen. All of them are maintained and overhauled at the Boa Vista workshops between Trindade station and the junction of Senhora da Hora at the end of a double-track section. The standard of cleanliness is good, difficult sometimes on the busy Porto lines, but like the whole of Portugal's railway system, everything appears to be excellently maintained. The Henschel tank number plate on chimney and works plate on tank side has had its quick service. Another 0440 Malay tank has been released from its train and a new cycle of events begins. The 282 tank begins its manoeuvres to run down onto its train. No trouble running bunker first with this commodious cab. And within a few minutes they're away with a quick shrill whistle before diving into the tunnel for the climb up the steeply graded double track to Senhora da Hora, its first stop en route to Póvoa de Varzim. Henschels did well on these narrow gauge lines in Portugal, building not only the 282 tanks but also the 0440 Malays, and, as we shall now see, an improbable and also compound 2460 tank, which works the Corgo line up from the Douro Valley. The Corgo line, the second up the long river valley, runs from Regior to Chaves, with a major centre en route to Vila-Real, the terminus for a number of trains, because Chaves is a long way north and the area bleak. Early afternoon at Vila-Real sees 3 trains, one up from Regior terminating there, and 2 coming from and going to Chaves crossing. Each has a compound 2460 tank, the only motive power used on the branch. The first mixed, all trains run in this format, behind a spotless number E208, moves out to drop back in the centre road to clear the way for the next northbound train. It consists of 5 tarpaulined wagons and 2 green 6-wheel coaches neatly fitting into the loop. The 2 coaches, one a clerestory, are mostly wooden-seated, giving cheap travel to the local farmers and country folk. But first class is available, with its antique comfort, plush furnishings and antimacassars. Vila-Real now becomes a busy station. Almost as soon as a southbound train comes to a halt, that from Regior comes in fast at the other end of the low platform. Passengers climb aboard, mail is unloaded from the red post vans, and the 2 trains are away almost simultaneously, one climbing up to Chaves, the other dropping down to the Douro Valley at Regior, which also has the workshops for this section. The southbound train drifts out of the station, the compound Malay tank making easy work of the falling grades, but the twisting curves limit speed to a gentle trot, the power bogies swinging easily into the bends. This is very much vineyard and olive country, with terraced hills on either side of the tracks. Station stops are short, just time to load and unload passengers and vans. It's a neat and tidy operation. At Regior, life becomes more formal, and the Corgo branch train is relegated to a bay platform. This is very much a dual-gauge station, and in consequence, there are 2 station pilots, an aging 060 tank, number E54, for the meter gauge system, and an equally venerable French-built compound 460, working out its last days on the 5'6". The train from Vila-Real is pulled out to release the 2460 tank. As this is running down to the disposal area around a dual-gauge turntable, the French compound drops a rake of coaches down into the Porto platform, ready for the broad-gauge connection to the big city. The coaches are sliding door, central entrance, modern suburban stock. Not the acme of comfort, but this is no fast intercity service. Until recent times, these broad-gauge trains were 100% steam operated, but today the diesels have arrived, and one of these will take the train west. It backs down slowly. To the left is one of the modern 284 tanks now used on the steam services, replacing the three classes of 460 which ran the trains for decades. The diesel moves off with a rumble and mutter. The new era on the Douro Valley line has begun. In fact, there's another diesel which has come in on a freight, sitting on an adjacent line, whilst we take a quick look at the modern and massive 284 tank. The 2460 tank moves onto the table, and a quick glance to the right has shown one of the old 460s still alive and working the odd train. All these roads off the turntable are multi-gauge and can be used by both meter and 5'6" gauge engines, willy-nilly. The Corgo line tank takes on coal, a laborious hand-carrying job, but labour in Portugal is cheap at present. Whilst this is going on, the 284 tank comes in with the mixed going east up the valley, which forms a connection with the evening Corgo line train being marshalled by 060 tank number E54, with a rake of open wagons to precede the coaches. At the same time, the French 460 drops extra coaches down to form the broad gauge train. The next period of activity is about to begin, for the Mallet tank is now backing into the narrow gauge bay platform, black smoke drifting lazily from her copper-capped chimney. The 284 tank moves off smartly, heading towards the Spanish border, making light of its load. It too carries its number on a brass plate fixed on each side, if one can use that term, of the chimney. The sign of the times are the electric wire warning plates carried on each of the two sand domes, for these engines are also used on the main line, which is fully electrified. As the Corgo line train moves up its twisting tracks on the journey north, it's said to reflect that soon these smart compound tanks will be ousted by diesel rail cars and diesel locos. They've served their valleys well and earned their retirement. Next up the Douro Valley is the Tour line, still using elderly 260 tanks with copper-capped bell-mouth chimneys as its sole steam power. But the blue diesel rail cars have already arrived. The branch is even longer than the Corgo's 61 miles. It's 84 from Tour to Braganca, needing a considerable number of water stops for the small tank engines. It's easy to see how diesel rail cars are so much better for railway and passengers. Mirandella is the first town of any size, and here the workshops service steam and diesel alike. The freights, which are really mixed, are still 100% steam worked. E82 is on the afternoon train north. One of the fireman's jobs is to damp down the slack coal in the leading wagon, immediately preceding the passenger coaches. It makes the dust a little, but not very much, less likely to fly. But needs must when the devil drives. The little tank has only a minuscule amount of bunker space for an 84-mile-long journey. A rail car and trailer comes in from the north. The old passenger stock is used as a second vehicle, the six-wheeler rocking about a bit as the rail car speeds round the curves. The line now clear, number E82, moves off with her short train. It will be a 6-hour journey before she finishes her tour of duty. Not bad for a lady of over 80 years.